Okay, so we have in our panel Professor Joanna Radin, who is assistant professor in the section for the history of medicine at Yale University, where she's also a member of the program for the history of science and medicine and the departments of history and anthropology. Her work is focused at the intersection of biology, medicine, and anthropology. She is completing a book tentatively titled Life on Ice, Cold War Frozen Blood, which examines efforts to salvage and freeze blood samples from members of indigenous communities in the decades after World War II. So this is very interesting. I'm interested in the genetic DNA in Argentina and the mother, so I'm really looking forward. And the commentator will be Professor Dani Rabinowitz, but I'll introduce him later. So first, Joanna. Maybe I should give the talk. Oh, you have just the microphone. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and just a huge thanks to Hagai and to Shai and Andy for inviting me. And I'm both pleased and nervous to follow Shai with his incredibly provocative, fascinating paper, but hopefully, and given that I will be mostly talking about non-humans, there will be some productive resonances or convergences that will emerge. So what I want to do in the time that I have is to talk a little bit about the project that was just mentioned, the book project that I'm finishing now, and to try to situate this paper in relationship to that project. And I'll do that very briefly and then kind of rehearse the argument as we've been talking about today and show some images, because I don't believe I had any in my paper, but there happen to be some good ones that come with the story. So this research, I began this research as part of my dissertation a while back, and I was really interested in technologies of preservation and issues of diversity. And I thought at first that I would look at these sites of natural history collecting and preservation, and that's what I did. But I increasingly, as I delved into the history of these technologies and the history of human genetic variation research, I realized that I wanted to write a book about efforts to, as we heard, collect blood from members of indigenous communities around the world, but particularly in Melanesia and Oceania, Melanesia and Amazonia, who were identified by scientists as themselves endangered and on their way out. And so when I started looking at these field notes of scientists who were making these studies, they were very excited about new access to freezer technology. And they said, this will allow us to freeze time. And we may not be able to save these communities, but we can save their blood, which will be valuable for future uses known and as yet unknown. So keep in mind, this was in the 60s, 70s. People were aware of DNA, but no one was talking about saying we will sequence their DNA. No one was talking about cloning, and that's an interesting question that we can discuss. What kinds of, when the substance is the same and when the technology is the same, but it's a human versus a non-human, what can be asked, what can be done, what can be performed on this material. So this is just an example of one set of the hundreds of thousands of human blood samples that are distributed around the world in freezers that were collected. This set from 1971, which persist until today and are being used for purposes indeed known to people in the 1950s and 60s and unknown. So I'll just the auspices under which the human collection efforts were organized was a program called the International Biological Program, which ran from 1964 to 1974, and it was largely known as an ecological program, and that's mostly been what the histories have focused on. This is a program that really formalized the language of biomes, which we're familiar with today in ecological theory, and also was very important in ecosystem ecology. It had 7 sections, only one of which focused on humans as their as they adapted to their environments. And for lots of reasons, which may be obvious and which we can certainly talk about later, indigenous communities were seen as ideal populations for studying questions of adaptability. They were purported to be closer to nature, more in tune or in harmony with their environments, and therefore would be particularly valuable resources, bodily resources, for understanding how Western techno-scientific civilizations had gone wrong, how they had become maladapted to the world. This just to show you a picture of the kind of politics we're dealing with here. I won't sort of do a reading of the Colonial Dynamics here, but this is a picture from 1966 in the Solomon Islands, one of the projects that was led through the International Biological Program, the Harvard Solomon Islands project team. You can see some of the hierarchies that were built into that expedition with the men who were standing being the Harvard scientists, some of them professors, most of them graduate students, and the men who were kneeling served both as porters but also as some of the many research subjects in the community. And so in the book I talk about these kinds of relationships and how you get someone you don't know to give you their blood, and what happens to that blood and to those relationships over time. Another picture of blood collection efforts in the field. This is an image, I apologize, it's not a great image, but sort of the field, this is a kind of classic field science picture, shirtless scientists, in cut-off shorts. This man right here is Carlton Gajdusek. For those of you who are familiar with Warwick Anderson's Collectors of Lost Soul, he was a Kuru scientist who also wound up later being convicted of pedophilia and lost access to his samples, his hundreds of thousands of samples that he had frozen and collected from around the world. But the samples continue and persist, and I spent a lot of time looking to see how those samples are being used today for purposes very unexpected, and also how the ethical regimes have shifted to make some of those samples unable to be used, but also unable to be thrown away. So this is just an example that, I don't know if you can read it. So this is from the lab where Gajdusek samples are maintained today. And I love this little wipe-off board. It was there for years. I went back a number of times. It says, blood will tell, but often it tells too much. And everyone I spoke to had an opinion about what that meant, but no one could tell me who wrote it, who had always been there and always will be there. And so you've got the top contains human serum samples. Don't put your food and drink in there. All specimens will go back into the even colder freezers. So a lot of the kinds of issues of cold and intersections of life and ice are kind of represented, pinned up on this refrigerator. So because we're talking about sperm, I thought that we would start leading us now into the paper itself with coming back to these non-human collections that are the focus of the paper, because it turns out if you start to look into the history of cryopreservation and the history of efforts to produce ultra-low temperatures, you have to pass through cattle breeders. In the 1950s, they realized that if they could develop a means for distributing sperm more easily than sending bulls around to inseminate their remote herds, then they could more efficiently and effectively standardize herds. So they could reduce variation in animal populations through the access to this technology of cold storage. And these cattle breeders in the American Midwest at American Breeder Service in Madison, Wisconsin, developed one of the first portable liquid nitrogen dewars. So liquid nitrogen is probably it's the coldest you can store something, in a negative 196 degrees Celsius. And these canisters that were developed particularly for agricultural purposes were very quickly adopted by biomedical researchers, so people at the WHO who wanted to collect blood serum in Senegal and ship it back to France. Actually went to everyone went to cattle breeders and said, teach us what you know, teach us how to freeze things. And so I decided to come back to this research that I had originally done on non-humans and talk about how this technology that was developed to initially help reduce variation in agricultural populations is then being repurposed to preserve variation in wild or so-called endangered animal populations. And part of this involves doing the history of cryobiology, or the science of frosty life. And this is an advertisement from the 1960s that gives you all of the kind of fantasy that surrounds this technology. Suspended animation, stopping and starting the biological clock at will, has been one of man's age-old dreams, including Jules Verne. Today, through cryobiology, scientists are slowing down and even theoretically stopping the chemistry of life's processes. And I just love this image of the tilted hourglass that makes it appear as though one might be able to freeze time. But I believe that is it's a category error. You cannot freeze time. Same year, lots of attention starts to emerge about this fantastic new technology and what it's going to allow people to do. And so this is an excerpt, a bullet-pointed article from the Science newsletter in 1962 that gave a number of different future possibilities of the ways that this technology might reveal itself to be valuable. So preserving large specimens such as the brains of vertebrates for study, long-time banking of antibiotic-producing organisms, for biomedicine, studying now unidentifiable but important intermediates in biochemical reactions. So this would be things maybe like DNA, like we know DNA is there, but we don't know what to do with it, and there might be other things in there that we are not sure of, and we can save it and it'll be there for us. Preserving today's generation of organisms for comparison with future generations, so this kind of making co-present different strata of reproductive time. And far in the future, the preservation of live plants and animals to prevent extinction of a species. And so as I say in the paper, it hasn't been quite possible to preserve a whole thing, although there were enormous amounts of experiments with hamsters in the 60s, golden hamster, of seeing if they could induce a hibernation and then thaw. And I every time I give a talk on this subject, someone will ask about cryonics, freezing whole people, and so I'll just say a little bit about that right now. So the cryonicists were very much a part of this community at the time. They went to the Society for Cryobiology meetings that started in 1964, and it was seen as a legitimate potential idea. And somewhere in the late 60s, they started to be cordoned off or seen as being too science fictional, that they were endangering the legitimacy of this field. So there's very interesting correspondence of them being told they cannot present at the Society for Cryobiology meetings, they cannot be a part of it, and while there is a whole interesting movement and some exciting anthropological work that's coming out about this practice that continues of people freezing themselves after they have died, because you have to be dead first in order to be frozen, and hoping for some future resurrection, that someone will thaw them and hopefully give them the life that they imagine they might want to live. And so there are questions there about what kinds of forms of faith and what kinds of ideas of the future do people who elect to have their whole selves frozen participate in. And so we can talk more about that, but I'm going to just put it aside and say, yes, I'm well aware of it, and it's very fascinating and interesting. But we're going to talk about something as a little more mundane, but for me, I think makes it more challenging. It's a tough case. Thinking about what do you do when you have a bunch of collections, you realize you can freeze stuff. You start to have access to it, and then everyone starts to have access to it, because it's not that hard to get access to a freezer or a liquid nitrogen canister. And so maybe you're doing a study, you go to collect a couple hundred specimens, you do your study, and then you put that back in the freezer, and maybe you forget about it, maybe you don't, it's there. And so people start doing this in the 60s, and by the 1980s, scientists start to both become concerned and excited. They're concerned because they're like, wait a minute, all these people have these collections, and we can see that science has progressed in a way. We can do more things with blood samples, with DNA, than we could do before, but we don't actually know what's there. Everyone has their own procedures, their own ways of managing these resources. We need to standardize. We need to plan. So in 1984, these two scientists, Herbert Dessauer and Mark Hafner, organize a National Science Foundation in the U.S. sponsored workshop, collections of frozen tissues, value management, field and laboratory procedures, and direction of existing collections. And I just love this image so much. So what you have here is basically it's its own sort of like trinity of you've got the liquid nitrogen canister, you've got the freezer that holds all of the specimen collections, and this here says -76, so this is a different kind of freezing technology that's approximately the temperature of dry ice, which is how that set point got there. And then you've got what I have been told by a certified mammologist is a gerbil, and in between is DNA. Right? This is the molecular potential that's going to have these technologies together give you this, which unlocks, I don't think I included this picture in here, but I have an amazing image of a refrigerator company, Revco. Does anyone work in a lab seen Revco freezers? They're basically like the standard in the back. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. The standard refrigerator, if you ever go into a lab, you'll see it says Revco, which stands for Refrigerated Vending Company. They started out selling ice cream, and then during World War II, like most companies, scaled up and started doing large-scale production. And so they sold two flavors, the monomat vanilla, the duomat vanilla or chocolate. And now I don't think they sell ice cream anymore. But one of their advertisements, it's really amazing, and I really should have put it in here. They've got a refrigerator with this sort of similarly, like with molecular iconography, molecules swirling out of the freezer, and the logo says the future, comma, inside. And so when you think about these ideas of temporality, there's the past in there, but there's also the future, which is why you need this idea of planned hindsight, which is an idea that comes out of this report where Dessauer and Hafner are saying, okay, we know there are going to be things in the future that we're going to want to use. We don't know exactly what they will be, but we want to make sure that scientists in the future, our future intellectual kin or progeny, look back and evaluate us as having thought about what they would need. So there is a certain kind of filial relationship here. And I read this. This is a very sterile kind of technical report that nonetheless has an enormous amount of affective, hopeful dimensions and a lot of assumptions about the future and about time. And so their concept, and this is an actor's category, planned hindsight, this paradox that you can, that you can imagine your future self or someone else looking back to the present, that is, will be then the past, and they can, you can evaluate and say, if only I had, or I wish I would have, and so to participate in that exercise of thinking forward about the past, which itself shapes the present. And what's interesting is the way in which planned hindsight is articulated in this report, despite the awareness of what can't be known, it posits a certain kind of linear temporality of progress, that science will accrete more and more properties that can be derived from these materials that will make them increasingly valuable. So it's like interest that will only ever continue to accrue. And so I was really interested in this, and I wanted to go and talk to people that were engaged in this project and say, well, okay, so this is 1984. I was in these labs in 2009, 2010. What's happened? Has it borne out yet? Has the future arrived? What's going on? What was planned? What wasn't planned? And what you got in the paper was two vignettes of different people in two different locations, in the Frozen Zoo in San Diego and the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, which is the big museum with the dinosaurs and the dioramas that Donna Haraway did her beautiful critical readings of, who had incredibly diverse ideas about what the role of these materials could be, that were both rational, but also quite fantastical. And I got very interested in this multiplicity, how there were multiple time frames and multiple kinds of futures and pasts and presents in play in these spaces. So I'll just quickly show you a few pictures from these two field sites that I think give representative examples of how various actors are coming together around these large-scale collections. So what distinguishes these two particular spaces, this zoo, this frozen zoo, and the Ambrose Monell Cryo Collection at the American Museum of Natural History, is that they are meant to be kind of clearinghouses of collecting collections, collecting smaller collections and allowing for a centralized repository where these kinds of materials can become available resources for scientists. And it's been very challenging to do this. People are not so willing to part with their resources in ways that I wondered about during some of the birdwatching discussions we had earlier today. If the scientists are defined by the species, it's understandable why they wouldn't be so eager to just say, yes, here, take my life's work, and you take care of it, and you put it in your freezer. So this is what this space looks like. These liquid nitrogen canisters, which are the same kinds of liquid nitrogen dewars if you go to a sperm bank or a seed bank or a frozen, egg bank. This is what it looks like. It's the same technology, the same apparatus. This is a poster that's been put together as an educational purpose, and you see here you've got the same kind of imagery of the animals going into the specimen case and the liquid nitrogen containers. So this is the whole world inside a box, right? You've got a snake and an elephant and a butterfly and a pigeon and lizards, and so it's all in there. But of course, it's not much to look at. You have to have a certain kind of imaginative capacity. And Julie Feinstein, who is the curator of this collection, she, I think she's the next image, yeah. So she was really wonderful to talk to because she had a very strong emotional relationship to this collection, being its caretaker and its steward, and does a lot of education. So here she is, she teaches the many students who come through this collection, what can you do? There's nothing to look at. So she uses liquid nitrogen itself as a kind of way to enroll children to say, look at how it can compress space, which is another way to thinking about the compression and expansion of time. So if you put a balloon in liquid nitrogen, it goes zzzz, and then if you take it out, it goes pop. And so it's this very, playful but visible manifestation of what she wants to communicate is going on in the freezer. And she, in our conversations, had this really, I think, very evocative, beautiful sense of, what do you think people get at when they come here? Why does the museum bring its trustees down here or people they want to donate to the museum? And she says, well, it looks like a spaceship, doesn't it? The freezers are sort of science fiction generation ships, collecting and safekeeping for unknown future uses. Going into the collection evokes a science fiction state of mind. Maybe it's the blank slateness of the tanks because look at them. They're just waiting to be projected on. And I got very interested in that kind of the way that fantasy intermingled with some of the more perhaps like rational or prognostic uses of the collection. So in the paper, I talk a little bit about other people connected to the collection who said, well, actually, this is in addition to helping us complete the tree of life. That's really the hard scientific work that this is going to do. This is an ongoing project, and the more things we can get in here, the more we can understand about evolution. But there are other scientists who say, well, like maybe we'll be able to clone things. Maybe we'll be able to do this stuff. And this is, I don't have it at the end. But in keeping Jurassic Park is about to be a new Jurassic World. It shocked me how often Jurassic Park came up in my conversations. I never brought it up. People would always say, this isn't Jurassic Park, we're not cloning anything, except that they sometimes were, particularly at the Frozen Zoo, which has come up and been mentioned, I think, already today, which is in Escondido, California, and maintains tissues and cells from over 9,000 individual mammals, birds, and reptiles, and is a space particularly dedicated towards conservation. And if you talk to people there, they say, well, actually, cloning isn't the end game. What we really want to do is preserve habitats. We want to. This is insurance. Like, we hope that we don't have to use this to bring animals back, but we can learn a lot about loss of biodiversity by understanding, maybe say, how much genetic variation is between all the cheetah samples we have. So that's one kind of example. So here you see the same liquid nitrogen canisters, and this is the sign that I described in the paper. It's in this like playful font, which is the only thing playful really about this space, except I can't really see it. I had a better picture, but right here is this Fisher-Price baby monitor that was put in the collection because people don't spend time in this room. No one's like hanging out here on a day-to-day basis. They're down the hall, in the molecular labs or in their offices. And there was a design flaw in how this thing was built. So the alarms, if the alarms go off, they only go off in this room. So they needed a way to hear the cries of the freezer. And there's something just about this as like a nursery, right? Like, that these are these almost things that are almost alive. Instead of being in a warm incubator, they're in a frozen one. So I could go on about that. But here, this is where we get to this another kind of invocation of Jurassic Park. This is Oliver Ryder, who is the sort of steward of the collection, and a very, like Dessauer and Hafner, he was at that meeting, and he was a part of that 1984 report I showed you. Strongly believes in the importance of centralizing these collections, or at least having a database so people know where they are. And every few years he's made an attempt to try to bring all the experts together to talk about what they're doing, where their collections are, and it doesn't quite ever happen. But what he said to me when I came, he said, I'm really happy that you're here as an academic and you want to understand the technology, you want to understand the science. Too often when people come to talk to me, they're focused on this Jurassic Park inspired fantasy, which is not what inspires my work at all. The focus is on conservation, finding ways to prevent organisms from going extinct in the first place. And then as soon as he said, Jurassic Park, I was like, well, I didn't say that. But Carrie Freese has, documented that there has been cloning work that's happened out of materials here, and it's sort of put to the side. However, at the Ambrose Monell Cryo Collection in New York, one of the scientists I talked to there, he was very comfortable with, he deliberately said, yeah, like Jurassic Park, it's a great way to get people to care about this stuff. And he even went and wrote a book called The Science of Jurassic Park, saying, what can we do and what can't we do yet? So I'm really interested in the fantasies and the way those things mingle. There it is. And of course, I put this one here because things go horribly wrong. You try to clone life and it doesn't quite work out. These gestations aren't always what we hope they might be, and it would be interesting to think about if Rachel gets her Kivan, is Felicity going to be the person that she wants her to be? Not that she's going to be a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but not for nothing are all the dinosaurs supposed to be female. This is his book, The Science of Jurassic Park and the Lost World. And I just had this image up here just to kind of also help open up the conversation that seed banks are also a part of this dialogue, these fantasies of the future, these fantasies of apocalypse and collapse and endangerment. This is from the Svalbard Doomsday Seed Bank, which is built into an old coal mining shaft, and is a site of similar kinds of practices as well. What's that? In Norway. And so I just close with this. I'll stop now with this image. So this is Kurt Benerschke, who's the founder of the Frozen Zoo, collaborated with Andy Warhol in 1986 on this really amazing coffee table book called Vanishing Animals. And in the foreword to the book, Warhol died, I think, either right before or right after the book came out, so there's no really commentary on how he responded to criticism, and I haven't gone to the archive to see if Warhol himself has any thoughts about it. But I won't read this aloud, but this is Kurt Benerschke's discussion of what's going on here, and this volume I think is evocative for me because it reduces this sort of complex specificity about these organisms to a Warholian style mass production sort of representation or iconic representation. And the book was actually reviewed in the Quarterly Journal of Biology, and which is a very serious history of biological journal of history of biology by Bentley Glass, who's an important geneticist at the time. And Glass, I still can't tell if he wrote this review tongue in cheek or serious. He said, what can possibly be the value of this book? The animal drawings are so vague as to be impossible to tell if it is even the right species. But I think that this kind of collaboration between the sort of fantasy and blurring the bounds between what is known and what can be known and might be known, and enrolling different kinds of emotion and affect in this project are really crucial for understanding what's at stake and thinking about planning for a future path. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Professor Dani, who is a professor of anthropology at Aviv University and is currently the head of the Porter School of Environmental Studies at Tel Aviv University. His areas of specialization are ethnicity, nationalism, Middle East studies, and the nexus between society and the environment. Having held visiting professorship at Princeton, NYU, and University of Toronto, he has published books with Cambridge University Press, University of California Press, Ashcott, London, and several books with Israeli publishers, including one on Route 6, and the first scientific book on the climate change in Hebrew. Articles by him appeared in leading social science journals, and so I think we can begin the comment. Thank you.
Dani, can you move a little bit more to the center so that we can see you?
Yes. Thank you, Leora, for this introduction. I want to thank Shai and the other organizers for this opportunity, and to thank Joanna for this very thought-provoking and entertaining at times paper, which I really enjoyed reading. I'll just offer sort of a number of disconnected thoughts about it, things that came to mind as I was reading it. I think it's for me it's a study of unintended consequences, of randomness, of social procreation, and reconstructed order, as the title indicates. Joanna recounts the divergent histories of these two collections. That's the centerpiece of her ethnographic work. These two collections of cryopreserved tissues. One is the Frozen Zoo in Escondido, the other is the one in the Natural History Museum in New York. And as I read the article, it struck me that it is structured, or it can be read as an allegory, because the two histories of the two collections in many ways mimic and their own histories of the two collections mimic the essence of what the practice of cryopreservation is designed to do in the first place, and that is to enable a later injection of meaning into a pre-existing material. This is what, in many ways, the vision of cryopreservation is all about. It can be a tissue, it could be a collection. There is a moment in the future when it will be rediscovered, reintroduced, reinterpreted, and new life would be injected into it. This is what the heroes, the ethnographic heroes of Joanna's work are actually doing. In both cases, if I am not wrong, they are not the initial instigators of the collections. They inherited them in a sort of in a social procreation process. They are the ones who inherit them, and they see themselves as responsible for the rediscovery. And it struck me that this is very much the ultimate vision of this intergenerational relationship that is created between cryopreserving scientists from one generation and their future progeny, as you said. Because cryopreservation itself, the deep freezing of animal tissues, is really intended to anticipate this future moment, this moment of phoenix-like transformation, where old DNA that had been suspended in a timeless, biologically inactive environment at minus 80 degrees centigrade is brought back to life. And then a little bit like what happens when somebody becomes interested in these collections, in the case of cryopreservation itself, a time capsule is being unleashed, and it now reveals old encrypted information and new possibilities to beholders who were unbeknownst and couldn't have been known, and they could have been imagined, but they couldn't have been known to those who embarked upon this journey many years ante. And not least, it's not only the identity of those who would be looking at these materials, whether we're talking about the collection or the analogical tissue itself. It's not only the identity of the new discoverers that we don't know, but we also cannot anticipate accurately the ways in which these new beholders would or might be examining the old materials. Their benefit of hindsight, as it were, is very difficult to imagine, and could not be fully anticipated by the original instigators of either the tissue or the collection. And that opens a very interesting space for interpretation and for fantasy, and of anticipating your own progeny in scientific terms, that really at least fired my imagination. So Joanna tells us that cryopreservation really began around 1949, more or less, with Polge's discovery that wrapped in glycerol, animal tissues, in his case owl sperm, can be preserved intact more or less indefinitely, and then spring to life back again whenever somebody wants to thaw them. And we learned that the new technology was adapted and applied in varied and somewhat haphazard ways. Scientists seeking cloning techniques, cow breeders seeking easier dissemination processes, entrepreneurs dreaming of amassing valuable collections to be sold, natural history museum curators and taxonomists and conservationists obsessed with impending extinction, all of them began stowing away tissues in deep freezers and slowly building randomly, according to this account, both individual and institutional repositories. And then the interesting twist, which I guess comes in the 80s and 90s, is that people are saying we need to create these into hubs. We need to collect, to centralize, to order, to have this hindsight organization. It struck me at that point that you might be using network analysis techniques to actually map what repositories ended up where, and use it not so much for I can see why biologists or geneticists would want these lines, and they may have it, but I'm more talking about the social analysis of these networks that were created at the moment of impending rediscovery, when your heroes were beginning to do their own life works with these collections. So it's about social and scientific inheritance. It's about bequeathing knowledge and data and lines of thoughts and lines of ideas. And it's about interpretations of scientific legacy. Then there is danger. The whole field is steeped in all sorts of dangers. And of course, Jurassic Park is the emblematic case where all of this can go horribly wrong. It actually goes wrong in Crichton's book in a much more sinister way than in a film. The film is a toned down, sort of almost bedtime kind of soothing tale when you compare it to the horrific goings on at Crichton's book. But it injects danger and suspense and ivadaut and uncertainty into this whole field, which imbues it with even more meanings. I want to end my intervention with another instance of looking at genetic material through time, using obviously different technologies and not involving freezing, but rather freezing time through a diachronic analysis of genetics. And I'm referring to something that I guess most of the Israelis are well aware of, and that is the efforts that were made at Hebrew University, mainly by Professor Batsheva Boneh in the late 60s and into the 70s and 80s, to say something intelligent about the genetic formation of the Jewish people. So what she was doing was to use populations and families and groups that had arrived in Israel mainly from Middle Eastern countries, but also from Europe. And when she was doing most of her sample collections in the 1960s and 70s, these people were, obviously recent arrivals, and there hasn't been so much interbreeding between different groups in Israel. And she was really looking at these Yemenite or Iraqi or Moroccan or Romanian villages sometimes or groups as moments frozen in time, and produced a series of researchers that were obviously very, very controversial, trying to ascertain the positioning of Jewish communities within the diasporas, where they had been living sometimes for hundreds and thousands of years. She also did a similar thing. This is how I got exposed to her work immediately after the 1967 war with the Bedouins in Sinai, and especially with the Jabalia tribe, which has its own sort of genealogy going back to Wallachia in Romania in the 6th century. So there again, a very definite moment in time that is preserved in order to make these diachronic leaps to understand life in ways that are novel. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you, Dani, for that really generous reading of the paper. And I just want to say two things, and then we can open it up. But I will start by saying the point where you conclude is very much what led me to shift my research to looking at human this work happening on human communities and human populations, because I became very concerned with this idea that indigenous peoples of various communities or populations could be fixed in time and seen as peoples without history, as Eric Wolf might have called them, or going back to anthropological critique of anthropology constructs its other by putting it outside of time, and freezing. Yes, yeah. And freezing. And the freezer technology seemed to offer a way to think about this. And of course, and Frederica and I have talked a little bit about this as well. Levi-Strauss called who he lamented in World on the Wane and Trees Tropique was the loss of cold societies that were being thawed by the incursion of modernity, and introduced this very evocative thermodynamic metaphor to make sense of what he was trying to analyze. And so this is very much what I'm dealing with in my book, and trying to get underneath this idea, and I'm having a really nice conversation with some people yesterday about, you never get to the bottom of identity, and there's a particular, there can be, and the technology does not have to imply this, but there can be a violence in freezing. There can be a violence in the idea that you can hold things steady. And what I have learned through my study of these technologies and their use is that you cannot freeze time. Time is not freezable. Life, maybe. Time is not. And so it's trying to separate out. Frederick is looking very concerned. But that time is flowing, and there are things that can become untimely or appear to become untimely, and I'm very interested in that. So the other thing that I wanted to say is that one of the ideas that I've been working with in my book is trying to break open ways of talking about time, and I've become very interested in this this Greek notion of kairos, which is the right time, or this special moment when things are revealed, or we might say when the future has arrived, or when the old material reveals its value, and putting that in distinction with chronos. So chronos would be the regularized clock time or year time, and kairos is this sort of moment of revelation or something like that. And so there's a sense in which it can work in multiple ways. And so in the book, scientists imagine lots and lots of potential uses to which the material of indigenous peoples and non-humans, but indigenous peoples could be used for. But the one thing they didn't imagine is that indigenous peoples would want their material back. That indigenous peoples, in a way, would be capable of salvage, that they would say, we want our material to be, the freezer is an insecure environment, and we want it removed. And so that they would reverse this exchange and this relationship and disrupt the inheritance and the progeny. And so I can go on at length, but I think your points really get to some of the key issues that I've been struggling with in the broader project.
So I guess I wanted to turn to this question of what kind of time is being unfolded through these preservation techniques. And I was thinking of, as you were speaking about the zoo in Escondido, of another institution of preservation that I think is quite close to Escondido, maybe in Escondido, called the Museum of Creation, which I don't know if you've visited, but it actually enacts as a natural history museum the closed temporality of apocalypse, the closed temporality of the book of Genesis, of the time that has already been written and is now unfolding. And obviously, that's not what we understand to be a scientific form of time. And I think you've done a good job of describing what the form of time of open-endedness of a future that we don't yet know what we will need these things for looks like. But I wondered if you could bring that into relationship with something like a time of apocalypse, because indeed there was a quotation toward the end of your paper about a hedge against apocalypse, and I wonder whether in some ways the idea of extinction actually interrupts this open-ended time of possibility, and it's more of a kind of secular return to apocalyptic temporality.
Should I answer on that? Yeah, great. I wish that I would have had that suggestion to go to the Museum of Creation, because it would have given me a way to talk about Christianity, which I really wanted to, and eschatology, but I didn't quite feel prepared to bring in this paper. I didn't feel like I had I tried it and it was not entirely successful, so I backed away from it, but I keep being drawn because I think absolutely there's a lot going on here, and I think it's, for me, what comes to mind is the ark, right? The language of arcs. And Iris, when I was reading your paper, I've been trying to think, is a list an ark, or is the list who's going to go on the ark? What kind of work does the list do? Is this a similar kind of freezing technology, right? Or is it operating in a similar kind of way? And so I think that very much in all of this work around the discussion of freezing, and particularly it becomes clear with extinction and endangerment, is an eschatology of human-induced apocalypse. And what's interesting, if you think about kairos, or if you think about soteriology, right, and salvation, so salvation is always kind of being invoked. There's the sense that these materials are going to be redemptive, that really, in the Doomsday Sea Vault is probably the best example of that. That, when everything goes down, somehow these freezers will still be here, and the people with the knowledge to use the materials within them will allow us to repopulate the Earth. The Ark will land on Ararat, the freezers, and then we will all be able to rebuild and start over. And so I think while nobody, talks in none of the scientists I spoke with will invoke that language, but it's absolutely there. There's the Ark Consortia, the Frozen Ark Consortia, which is how these larger organizations in the UK understand that kind of potential. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
exactly,
it's
I
there.
was thinking precisely
Yes.
about the Ark as what underlies a lot of the preservation effort.
Yeah, and so I'm super excited to go to the Biblical Zoo tomorrow. It's going to be great. Thank you.
So, Joanna, I wanted to go back to Ryder's quote that this is done for conservation. Try to so I'm not sure if this is obvious. It might be. So kind of just to raise so within zoos, the gene bank or the frozen zoo is very contested because zoos are moving, or at least certain zoos are moving toward this narrative of being part of conservation, mostly in situ conservation. So the distinction between lab and field is invoked, and definitely this is lab. And so a lot of conservationists have a aversion toward this frozen zoo concept for a variety of reasons. So when I interviewed people around, like I told you, the Cryopreservation of the Smithsonian Institute, and they were basically spelling out the major concern is that life is actually taken out of context, whereas conservation are moving more and more toward conservation within a context rather than kind of in the lab or in captivity. So there's an aversion toward conservation in captivity that is being now reopened or rehashed. But I think there was a hope, perhaps, in the zoo world, like one of my interviews was telling me, that gene banks would have an important role, but then it collapsed because it was clear that number one, life changes within the frozen context. So when I interviewed cryopreservation scientists, they were just actually telling me they don't really know what's going on there. They have documented changes. And then also the habitat changes. What context would this life be in? So there are a lot of, for conservationists, there's a lot of problems with actually making mere life, saving mere life. In a way, it's simplifying, it's reduced, it's reductive, it's monadic. So I found that there were, and this connects to the aversion with de-extinction. Because if you freeze it, then there's always this idea, so why don't you even bother saving it, right? I mean, if it's frozen, then we can always revive it. And so I think a lot of species conservationists are really wary of the rewilding aspect, of the de-extinction project, right? This kind of raising from the dead, because then how does it deal with the existing endangered species? How do those revive? So that's I guess that's one comment, and I was wondering if that's something you encountered, because you put it as if zoos do this, and actually I think only 2 zoos in the country do it on that kind of scale. I think in the Smithsonian 7,000, in San Diego Zoo it's 9,000 species. All right, and then it's just really interesting. So it's great. Thank you. And then I guess something that I don't know what brought it up for me in your paper, Joel Sartor's The Last Animal, his freezing is going to zoos, from zoo to zoo, and documenting the last animals. He has this photo project, basically making an arc of photos. So this is his frozen dimension. So that was one comment that came to mind when I was reading your paper. And then your attempt to kind of move from freezing humans to freezing non-human animals to freezing plants. And I'm wondering about what are we doing with these, like, different categories. What happens in this shift? Is freezing different? I guess it connects your papers, and well, maybe we can bring it to bear. Do we are the same issues coming up? The same ethical issues, the same technological issues?
Yeah, great. I'll be very brief in my answer, but I would love to talk more about all of these issues. I'll say on the conservation piece, I think if Ryder was here, it's been a while since I talked to him, but I think what he would say is that I agree. He would say, yes, the point is to, and he says this here, not to let them go extinct in the first place. So if we have access to these materials, we can learn something about the populations that are there and intervene at the level of the habitat or intervene in these different ways. Whether or not that actually happens is beyond what I'm dealing with here, and I think I wouldn't be surprised to hear that there's a lot of resistance to this mode and that this is seen as a potentially reductive space that's technologically intensive and sexy in some senses, weirdly, but is not actually going to produce.
Anthropocene, right?
Well, yeah. So the Anthropocene is coming up in a lot of ways, and so the answer to the third question, or I think the third question about how does freezing kind of connect in all these different ways. So I'm involved in this project that Frederic is also involved in, that we're calling Cryopolitics, which I bet you will be interested in, which has been an effort to sort of, I have my own cases that work in these particular ways, but to say what happens if we think about freezing across the sort of biomedical and the environmental, and we think about it in the frame of maybe use the Anthropocene as a critique of the Anthropocene, and say what can we see when we look at both anxieties about melting glaciers, but also efforts to freeze different kinds of things in different ways. And so that's, I think we're wrestling with that. But what I can, so I can't give you like a simple answer, but what I can say is that there's certain things that run across, and I've been as I've been listening to papers all day, been trying to think, would this work? And it sort of does, is a sense if we take Foucault's ideas about biopolitics of making live and letting die, then maybe cryopolitics is about making live and not letting die. Those spaces of whatever it may be, or whatever form of resistance to death, and we can see that as it kind of becomes problematic when we think about evolutionary theory and the dynamism that adheres to that, of things coming into being and disappearing. So great questions and lots more to talk about.
So my question is follows on conversations I've been having with David, including in the context of David, your paper. So it's important in your story that there's always a purpose. The preservation done in the present is for some proposed future, right? So we don't preserve. It seems as if we're not preserving for the sake of preserving, but preservation. But there's some goal. We don't know it exactly. We need to imagine it. We need to fantasize about it. I wonder whether we couldn't tell a different story. I mean, this is not the story your actors tell, but you can tell a different story. That there's actually preservation for the sake of preservation, and then the rationalizations are kind of very limited. And since it's anyway, it's clear that we won't know what lies in the future. That the act of preservation becomes in some ways an end in itself, and this would bring these forms of preservation, of biological preservation, closer to what we do ordinarily when we preserve culture. So it's clear that culture will be reinterpreted in the future, and that whatever we preserve now for the future generations won't be the same once it comes to the hands of the future generations. And this brings art and science, which is the end of your presentation, together in a different way. So what I think is this will make more sense for the Israelis, but I'll try to translate, is the Boydom effect. And the Boydom is where Israelis put their shmonses, which is also difficult to translate, but this you get. They put all their old stuff that they don't want to throw away because who knows if one day we'll need it. Yeah. And then the question and so then every year you go through this stuff in the Boydom, because the Boydom attic, the place where you store these things.
Every year, I wish. Every second decade.
Every second, no, but there's a process because it's full, and you need to. Anyways, So you take out the sweater and you say, and then you make up a story of why this will be needed for some future generation, and then you put it back in the Moiden. And so I wonder whether there's not part of that going on, and this analogy, more fundamentally, this analogy between nature and culture is actually at stake here. And this would also explain why, at some point, the indigenous people actually are demanding back their culture, which we know is happening all the time, and also their nature, their biology. So this would work with that.
I think that I don't think that is in conflict at all with the analysis that I draw. I mean, I think when I first started writing the paper, I was putting the kind of fantasy versus the real planning purposes that people said, but then I'm like, they're all kind of a rationalization in one way or another, an explanation for this desire to maybe hoard or stockpile or just have things just in case. And your particular example, since I've been here, I keep thinking about this book, Sacred Trash, about the Cairo Geniza, which is a storehouse of papers that can't be destroyed because they have the name of God on them, but they aren't being used anymore. And so there's supposed to be a ritual moment where you go in and you bury them, right? Where you say, you allow them to die, you take them out of that liminal state. Except it didn't happen there for several many hundred years. And then that Cairo Geniza, winds up in Cambridge and being used for all these things. And so that concept of sacred trash just comes up for me again and again and again. And I think when we deal, sometimes people ask me in my work, well, why does it matter? This is another way of your question. Why does it matter that this stuff is living stuff? This is tissue, and as opposed to the Elgin marbles or any other kind of thing. And there's a way in which it doesn't. And so the freezer is interesting because it's a kind of extreme version of practices of preservation that circulate and that we do in all kinds of ways. But then there are other ways in which it does matter because this material does have a certain kind of it's seen as sacred in a particular sort of way, and part of it is about its pluripotency, maybe for lack of a better word, or its ability to become the different kinds of things, which is maybe, and I haven't really pushed this through, and the cultural anthropologists in the room will get me on this, I'm sure, but if you said, culture changes and is dynamic, but there's this way in which this tissue contains all these different constituents that are relevant to different constituencies, and so this little vignette I end with Wolbachia, that it re-specifies the whole collection, and so probably it's not different. You can make an argument for culture as well, but your point is very well taken.
As you rightly suggest, that freezing time is a contradiction in terms. So what do we have instead? What we have instead is what Vic Turner called an atemporal moment, which is a state of liminality, actually.
Exactly.
And the state of liminality is not about the future necessarily. It's about creating identity based on the past. In other words, there's the attempt to preserve a sense of continuity in the face of maybe the apocalypse, the unknown future, something that we can't possibly predict, as Jan suggested before. It's random, it's haphazard, it's unintended, question of unintended consequences, and so on. So we're talking about the past, we're not talking about the future.
Right, and that's why
it's a state of, as a state of waiting.
Right, and so I have a paper called Latent Life, which I very much engage these ideas, Turner's ideas of liminality. And what is interesting and why I talked about that image of the freezer ad saying the future inside, the way I see it is the past is what's inside. So yes, thank you. That's very nicely said.
I have a most amazing story for you from the Babylonian Talmud to illustrate the planned hindsight. It is said that when God finished writing the Torah, Moses saw him sitting, still putting final touches to every single letter, kosher ksharim laTorah in Hebrew. And Moses says, well, that's the perfect text. What are you still working on? So he says, I know that in 1,000 years' time, there will be some genius called Rabbi Akiva who will read extremely carefully every word that told you. So Moses doesn't understand. So I'll illustrate it to you. So he puts him into a time machine. That's in the Babylonian Talmud.
This is in the Babylonian Talmud.
1,000 years later to Rabbi Akiva. He sits there in a rabbinical school at the last row, Moses, and the one who gave the Torah, so he's supposed to understand everything in it. And he sees this Rabbi Akiva giving a lesson, giving an interpretation of the text. And Moses doesn't understand a single word. He's horrified. How come he doesn't understand it? Goes back to well, it goes on, and then he's reconciled. He's calmed down because at some point in that unintelligible discussion, he hears that the rabbi says, where do I know it from? It's written. It was given by Moses. So Moses sits there and is now satisfied. Goes back to God. Now he understands what was the planned hindsight. Now I want to, because Dani Rabinowitz also used it as, I can call it the intelligibility gap, and it goes back to Shai's question. What are our motives? After all, as Dani mentioned, we have no idea how they are going to interpret what we leave them, our theories and our specimens, etc. Why are we interested? I mean, you're interested in our response to your lecture because
I'm here.
You understand more or less what we are saying. But had it not been the case, and we would have responded enthusiastically to your paper, but you wouldn't be able to understand the word, would it be of any interest to you to give a lecture?
Yes, thank you. No, I don't know. No, I mean this is why I find this so interesting. And I see it as a historian, as a historian of science, and a historian of the Cold War in particular. There is such a confidence that this is going to be valuable in some way. We don't know, but it will be, and it almost doesn't matter if we can understand it or not, but it will be valuable. And what is interesting to me is to think and we're not supposed to as historians use counterfactuals. We're supposed to just say this is what happened. We can't imagine what would happen, but I like this because it gives me space to do that. Is if we said, I like to ask, are there uses for which the scientists would be saying, no, you can't? And I think that one of the you can'ts is you can't give it back. You can't throw it away. So giving it back is a purpose of it. It is culture that's circulating, that's rescaling relationships, and so that's what's so interesting to me about this temporal frame. But yeah, we were having also a conversation about like how do people make warnings for the future at the Reinvention of Time workshop that we were at a few years ago. There was this talk about how do you make structures that will allow people in the very distant future to know that a space has radiation or toxic, whatever. And all of these experts get together, and what do they come up with? It looks a lot like Stonehenge, what they come up with.
Right.
So, that's your story. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Stonehenge.
Yeah. All right.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have that clear in my thought, but I hope I'll be able to pass my message. Firstly, our paper really made me think a lot about the futurity, like the temporality of the future, as something which is very strong eventually today in environmental discourses, speaking about all these conservation efforts in the name of the future, and how ridiculous it is in a way to create all these images in the future when we're living in an era where everything changes and the techno-scientific culture really impacts that future. So I think, Shai, in relation to the topic of the conference, that maybe this is something that is of a connection between that loss and preservation. How do we imagine the future? And is that sort of exploration does it make sense to explore the future in such way? It also reminded me in that sense of preservation of indigenous materials, and she speaks about how it is all based on the idea that indigenous people are going extinct. And she very seriously rejects that idea of indigenous people are going extinct. And I thought in that sense, could we talk in the same way? I mean, of course, there's the whole discourse that rejects extinction in the name, in the sense of it's just a way that the natural world works through. But can we reject the idea of extinction of the natural world, mostly in the sense of also the natural world is changing and just creating that, you know, composting and creating cycle again? So is that preservation of the frozen materials ridiculous in that sense as well? And the last thought was, Shai, you mentioned earlier today the ontology, but more as like historical ontology, right? I thought more of the hauntology in terms of haunting ontology that both Derrida and Karen Barad relates to. I thought a lot about that hauntology in terms of these materials as well. I think it's a very interesting formulation of what do we do with these materials eventually, and what are they for, and how do they haunt us to know that there's these enormous banks of these genetic materials and frozen tissues, and so those were
they may not be, they're very clear to me. I feel like you've been reading my book manuscript or something. Maybe you did. But so in terms of the temporality of the future, there's a way in which this project has led me into a new project, which you can go to online, not right now, but histsci-fi.com, which is a histories of the future, which we're trying to look where ideas about scientific speculation and ways that scientists speculate kind of can converge or merge with science fiction narratives themselves. And it was through this work that I actually got very interested in Michael Crichton as a figure that does that really well. And so I've been starting to try to think about him. And it's very new, but this history of the futures and trying to understand use historical tools to look at how people have imagined futures in the past, I think is very powerful. And I'm very interested in particularly thinking in medical context, you know, and whose futures get to matter, whose futures are legitimated as possibilities. And so it's a little bit what I was getting at. You know, Karis Thompson's beautiful essay on Confessions of a Bioterrorist. She has this amazing line where she says, you never know what gestations will save the world. You know, and it could be this supposedly monstrous hybrid of a female scientist who impregnates herself with a bonobo, embryo. So these kinds of things are very interesting to me, and I think that there's a utopian dimension. If we can think about the future and histories of the future, maybe we recover different kinds of possibility for organizing. The present is one way to think about it. Kim Tallbear, yes, I'm indebted to her in so many ways, and we collaborate on a lot of different levels. And I was thinking actually about hauntology and haunting when I was listening to Shai's talk. I was thinking about Avery Gordon and her work on haunting the sociological imagination, where she tries to look at not just to see the sperm. We might apply say the sperm isn't Kivan, but Kivan's ghost is also present here, and he has his own subjectivity that needs to be taken seriously in that context. And I wondered if you're maybe not in metaphysics, but if you're the religious dimensions that you're talking, it has room for the spectral, and where we might think about that. So thank you. That was really wonderful.
Okay, I have, not sure if you can answer this, but I was wondering more, not about the people who work with frozen collections, but the people, I mean, what happens in the present if all these new uses so-called unintended consequences or unintended uses, how the people who use them for research, do they need to find new ways of explaining why they use it in the unintended way?
Are they accountable to anyone?
Yeah, is there a need to justify or manipulate their use? I'm asking this because you kept talking in other examples here. I kept thinking of the archive as something so similar, of course. I mean, nothing new, but I was thinking about all these historians that I know. I mean, some of the examples from a conference Leora and I participated in last week, and various people had to come up with various excuses or all types of manipulations to use the archive in the way that's different from what it was intended to be used for.
Yeah.
So I guess if the people feel they have to come up with all these explanations.
Yeah, I love that question, and I think in a way it gets to the root of what I think I learned about my own methods through doing this project. So when I started doing the work, I was getting a certain kind of pressure from some of my advisors that I needed to point a finger and find like the bad people that had done the bad thing. And it just, as I went and talked to scientists and we talked about their knowledge practices and them making knowledge out of these specimens that were collected for other purposes, I thought, there's one archive that I spent a lot of time, or one space I want to spend a lot of time in, of human collections that's called a serum archive. It's like a blood archive. That's their term for what it is. And I started to think about my own profession's lack of reflexivity about how we make knowledge using the archive. And I have a colleague, we have this debate, and so he works on medicine in 19th century France, and he talks about this diary that he found from a soldier that said, "If found, burn." And he likes to tell the story of how he didn't burn it because it was too good. It was too good for his work, and he's able to say that, and people say, yes, the heroic, and this is someone I have deep respect for. He could do that. And I don't believe there are certain circumstances, and this is where the human, non-human breaks, or the indigenous, the vulnerable human versus, another kind of human breaks down. There are uses that people do say we want our materials back. So in many cases, there are not formalized ways that you have to justify, but the classic case is the Havasupai in the American Southwest, who were studied by scientists. They voluntarily gave their blood for studies about diabetes, and then scientists continued to use that blood to look for genetic patterns of schizophrenia and alcoholism and ancestry issues that threatened their sovereignty. And they said, no, like, we want it back. And they sued, and the lawsuit was settled, but they got those materials back. And so I actually have a paper that's coming out in American Ethnologist, which is a collaboration with an anthropologist in Australia who's looking at a collection that was made during the IBP and stored in Australia. So I'm looking at Carlton Gajusek's materials, where they are now, and she's looking at this guy, Robert Kirk's materials, and where they are now, and they collaborated, they shared specimens, and because of the shifting kinds of moral economies around indigeneity in Australia versus the US, there are different protocols that people have to go through in order to justify new uses for old things. And what we've been really interested in is these ways that ethics break or shake out in different ways, but may be feeding back into each other. So there's not a simple answer, but it's the right question.
Okay, I have my questions, but I get a warning that we should end. So thank you for both.
Thank you.
Thank you.